Hey, so good to be with you this morning in Inland Hills. As Pastor Josh said, I'm Mark Lohman at the Bridge, and I really, really mean this. What a joy and an honor to be here. Us lead pastors in this area, we do believe that God is up to something new. Churches are coming together. Pastors are meeting together to pray for this area, and that's what wakes me up in the morning. And let me say this too. Second service here, man, the worship team, beautiful name. Oh my gosh. I was kind of like, I'm not sure if I need to go up. I mean, that was better than anything that I'm going to do. So that was amazing. And a couple things about Josh. And no, he didn't pay me for this, or he hasn't taken me out to lunch, although maybe you're more than welcome to take me out to lunch if you want, Josh. I do like In-N-Out. Josh is amazing. I want you guys to know this. We kind of arrived here at the same time, both from outside of the Chino Valley, and he's been a mentor of mine. He's been there for me. Hopefully I've been that to him, but he has much more wisdom than I do. I want you guys to know you have an amazing lead pastor. He's gifted. Josh is a brilliant strategist. And so just for you guys to know, you have another lead pastor in this area, another church, many others who are rooting for you. I know IHC in the last couple of years has gone through a lot, and so I hope you're encouraged that God has put you in really, really good hands, okay? All right, let's get going this morning. I got a story to introduce to you. It's about a teenage boy named Danny. And Danny had quite a traumatic upbringing in his teenage years. He was kidnapped. And literally taken away from his home, his family, siblings, everything, into a foreign country. A country that spoke a different language, a different culture. He literally had to eat different food. I mean, like, when you go and you do some international traveling, you have to eat different food. Sometimes it doesn't settle too well in your stomach, and then you got some other issues. Teenage Danny probably experienced that. And the interesting thing about teenage Danny is that he was extremely gifted, well-educated. The girls thought he was good-looking. He was strong. Teenage Danny was a leader to be reckoned with. And these kidnappers, they rename him. Literally, they give him a new name. And so he has to kind of rethink his identity. He has to learn a different language, all that kind of stuff. He's scared. He's anxious, as much of us would think if we were in that situation. And perhaps maybe the most traumatic thing is that teenage Danny had his entire life before him. Big dreams, visions, a leader to be reckoned with. And now, it's gone. He's kidnapped. And he's wondering, am I ever going to be able to be the influencer that I thought God had called me to be? And what's crazy about teenage Danny is that against all odds, he ends up influencing a nation. And not just a nation, but like presidential figures. He influences a culture. And it wasn't because of his good looks. Wasn't because of his intelligence. Teenage Danny had influence because he was faithful. He had a strong character and an amazing work ethic. I mean, if you haven't caught on yet, this is a true historical story. And teenage Danny is actually Daniel in the Old Testament. And so we're going to hop into Daniel this morning. It's in the Old Testament if you're new to church. If you grew up in the church, he's a well-known dude. Usually people talk about him in the lion's den, and we're going to hop into that in chapter 6. And let me also say this morning is just hopefully going to kind of whet your appetite. The good thing is, if you don't like anything I say this morning, I may not be preaching again here. And so Josh is taking you into a new Daniel series, 3 weeks, August 1st. So if you don't like this, Josh will be doing the Daniel series. It'll be amazing. If you do, then you'll be here for the book of Daniel. So it is a fun book. Josh is kicking you guys off August 1st, and it just so happened that we kind of lined this up. So here, if you have a Bible, jump in Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. We'll put it up on the screen as well. Daniel 6:1. I'm kind of navigating in and out of this chapter and explaining it for us. But we need to start with some important historical background information. So here's the scene, Daniel 6:1. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom is Daniel. And the satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Quick pause button. Here's what's going on. There's a new empire, a new king in town. This is the 6th century, 500-600 years before the time of Jesus. And this new king is King Darius, and he's a part of the Persian Empire. And as is often the case with new kings, he comes in and he does a reorg. And what he does is he takes 120 satraps. Think of these as like governors. So he appoints 120 governors all throughout the Persian Empire. And then he takes 3 administrators. Think of these as vice presidents, all right? And so 120 governors and then 3 vice presidents over them. Daniel, teenage Danny, is one of them. So he's very, very high up in the Persian government. And this is highly unusual because Daniel's Jewish. He's not Persian. He didn't grow up there. In fact, he was captured there and taken into exile. Now, you may be asking, okay, well, how in the world did this teenage boy climb the ladder and get up to be a vice president? Great question. Here's the answer. We'll start in verse 3. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And at this, the administrators and the satraps, they tried to find grounds to charge Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charge against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So here we are, chapter 6. Now, contrary to maybe what you learned growing up, Daniel in this scene in chapter 6, we think he's probably 83 years old. All right? He's no longer teenage Danny. But in chapter 1, when he shows up, he's a Jewish teenage boy who had been kidnapped. Chapter 6 is 60 years later from chapter 1. And so Daniel's been here decades. He's seen kings come. He's seen kings go. New empires, old empires, all coming and going. And Daniel has earned this reputation amongst everyone. He's earned a reputation as a trustworthy politician. Now, to me, those two words don't usually go together, all right? But here he is, smart, shrewd, trustworthy politician with high character, high integrity, so much so, again, he's not Persian, he's a Jewish exile, that King Darius appoints him as his right-hand man, makes him number 2 in the empire. This is like a huge, huge deal. And so all the rest of the politicians, they're jealous. They're jealous that King Darius chose an outsider and not someone from within. So here's what they do, verse 6. So these administrators and satraps, they went as a group to the king and they said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, governors, like this is everyone, have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or any human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree, put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. And so King Darius put it in writing. King Darius, you got to know this, he's pro-Daniel. I mean, this is his right-hand man, full of wisdom. And now all these local politicians have kind of ganged up against Daniel and have ganged up against the king. And they pressure him to make a law for 30 days that no one in the empire can pray to any other god except King Darius. Of course, Daniel's Jewish, so he worships the God of Israel. So here, this is a problem. And now we read Daniel's response. And he's so calm, so steady during this manipulative lawmaking. Verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs rooms where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and he prayed. And he gave thanks to his God. And if you have a Bible, physically underline this. Just as he had done before. And then these men went as a group and they found Daniel praying and asking God for help. And so they went to the king and they spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. And then they said to the king, Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel, and he made every effort until sundown to save him. King Darius really, really likes Daniel. He doesn't want to put him into the lion's den. But again, he's got all the social pressure. And he put this law in place, can't break it. That was part of their custom. And now, lo and behold, he puts Daniel in the lion's den. Now, I'm going to assume that most of us here probably were taught a certain version of this story. If you're like me, I grew up in the church, and so I did the whole Sunday school thing. And probably the biggest thing that I remember about Sunday school is like the flannel felt board. Anybody here? Come on. Let me see some hands. All right. You guys are a little bit more active in first service. This is good. So, you put the thing on. Daniel always looked like this to me. He looked like this young, strapping, buff, like white dude. And that is not what Daniel looked like. Sorry to ruin your vision, but Daniel was old. He was frail. He was weathered. Probably had a cane. He lived decades of a traumatic experience of being in exile. And of course, he would have been Middle Eastern. And so that's kind of the picture here of the lion's den. It's like this traumatic, weathered life that has gone through so much. That is the Hollywood scene. And now we read about the next morning, verse 19. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and he hurried to the lion's den. And when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? And Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I done anything wrong before you, your majesty. And the king was overjoyed, and he gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted out of the den, no wounds were found on him, because he trusted in God. That's the story that we're looking at this morning. We don't have time to go there, and maybe Pastor Josh will do this in the series that you guys are heading into. But if you go back to chapter 1, we learned that teenage Danny was resolved. And they use that word. I love that word, resolved. He was resolved that in the midst of being in an outside different culture, that he was resolved to not become like the culture that he was in, to turn into acting like a Babylonian or a Persian. And see, one of the tricky things about being in exile is this isn't just like a 6th century BC thing. I mean, the scriptures are so relevant to us today. I think a lot of Americans today who have grown up in the church, we kind of have this feeling that it feels like we're in exile right now in America, meaning it's not like what it used to be. The phrase for this, sociologists have been saying this for about a decade or two now, is that they describe America as a post-Christian nation. And what they mean by that is that Christianity used to be the dominant religion in America. Like, it was just assumed that you grew up in the church, that you did the flannel felt board thing, all of that. It was assumed that you had a biblical worldview. The thing is, and we can debate this and all that kind of stuff, but that's just not true anymore. A lot of people don't grow up in the church. And so we have this question, like, what do we as Christians do with our culture that we're in? A lot of times people do one of two things. They either become just like the culture they're in. So there's no difference between being a Christian and then living in secular America. The opposite end of that is to just withdraw. It's to separate, like it's to run and flee. And the thing is, actually, both of those options are wrong. Daniel gives for us in this book such a clear example of what it means to live in exile, to live in a foreign culture, and to follow Jesus and have influence. That's what I want you to see this morning. And so the question is this: how did Daniel influence this Babylonian Persian culture that he was exiled to? How does he influence a culture that doesn't worship the God that he worships? Now, to dig into this, sometimes this is helpful for me, is to learn what we shouldn't do first. That makes what you should do a little bit more clear. Here's what I don't think we should do in 2021. I don't think it's of any worth to just go start a cultural war and just to battle and bark and argue with people over politics and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I don't know about you, but every time I log on to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, I mean, there's just always that person who's like posted that vicious political article and just going off. And I kind of chuckle about that inside me, because if you know the way social media works, I mean, they have algorithms, and the people who are watching your posts are the people who follow you, and chances are the people who follow you think just like you. So you're really just talking to yourself as an echo chamber. It's actually not strategic. I mean, like, if you want to influence, that's probably actually not the way to do it. You're just bouncing off yourself, all right? There's so many other things that we do. And the thing is, usually when we fight cultural roles and we attack politicians, whatever side you're on, honestly, it actually makes you look bad as well. I don't know if people realize that, but people who bring negativity to something, they're not bringing a solution. Daniel. How does Daniel influence this culture that he's exiled to? Here's the answer. And it's the answer for us today. If you want to have influence, you need to be a faithful witness. A faithful witness. Well, Mark, what in the world does that mean? It means three things. If you're a faithful witness, you will practice excellence, you'll have a strong character, and you will be faithful. Excellence, character, faithfulness. That's what I want us to see this morning. First one, excellence. Verse 3. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps, here it is, by his exceptional qualities, that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And at this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct, his work of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. Daniel excelled at his job. Daniel was a craftsman. He literally did good work. We know from chapter 1 that Daniel, he put in hours, weeks, months, learning their language, which was Akkadian. He learned their food. He learned their literature, their astrology, and he did this for decades as a teenage boy all the way up to his 80s. And he got the reputation as basically being impeccable in his political career, such that the most powerful man at that time, King Darius, over the most powerful empire in the Middle East, recognized Daniel and said, I want you to be my right-hand man. I think it's important to say Daniel's goal, Daniel wasn't trying to be influential. He wasn't trying to gain power. And also, I don't think Daniel foresaw himself when he was younger, like going to an enemy kingdom and working for them. I don't think that was a part of his game plan. But what Daniel's game plan was, is that he wanted to excel at whatever God put him in. Whatever situation God put him in, he wanted to excel in that. And so the question for us this morning is this: are you practicing excellence in your job? Whatever you do in your work, are you known for putting out excellent work? And I'm just going to assume here, right? There's lots of different vocations and careers in this room. Perhaps you're an accountant, an educator, law enforcement, a parent. Like that is certainly a full-time job. And it needs more benefits to it, right? I got 2 little kids. We got tons of different careers in here. Are you practicing excellence in your job? Do you influence other people in that way just like Danny? Your work matters because in it you have the opportunity to spotlight Jesus Christ. Second, excellence and now character. Verses 4 through 5. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And finally, these men said, we'll never find any basis for charges against this man unless it has something to do with the law of his God. See, Daniel had impeccable character. Daniel was a man of integrity. It wasn't just that Daniel was gifted, it was that he could be trusted. I think our culture today has devalued character in the name of how gifted are you. You can be excellent, but if you don't have a strong character, you're not going to be that influential. There's a modern day translation by Eugene Peterson out of the Message, and I love how he translates this depiction. He puts it this way: the vice regents and governors got together to find some old scandal or skeleton in Daniel's life that they could use against him, but they couldn't dig up anything. He was totally exemplary and trustworthy. They could find no evidence of negligence or misconduct. And so they just finally gave up and said, we're never going to find anything against Daniel unless we can scheme up something religious. So let me ask you this. Would people say the same thing about you? Isn't that kind of an alarming question to ask? If people looked at your life and they went to dig out your skeletons, would they find anything? Daniel was a man of integrity. And I don't know about you, but every time I turn on the news or go online, it just seems like there's another story of another politician. Honestly, a lot of times it's Christians and pastors at that. And so I'm humbled to say this. And it's these people, these leaders, these Christians who you just hear about another story of sexual harassment, or that they came up and had some sophisticated financial fraud scheme going on. How does our culture view us? Do they know us as people with high character? See, we live in a post-Christian culture, and I actually think it's an amazing time to follow Jesus right now. Because in a post-Christian culture, it's only real Christianity that won't just survive, but thrive. We have the opportunity with our character to point to our God. God is looking for people. He's looking for you. He's looking for people who are undefiled, unafraid, and uncommon, just like Daniel. You want influence? Have strong character. Lastly, faithfulness. This is like the least cool one, I think, but it's the most important. Remember how Daniel responds to this situation, verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and he prayed and he gave thanks to his God just as he has done before. What a beautiful line. Just as he had done before. Here Daniel is, 83 years old. And I'd be willing to bet that as a 15-year-old teenage boy, every day, 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and he prayed. I mean, this was like a built-in organic schedule to his life. I mean, it's with the small things in life that he was so faithful. He was so faithful, such that when crisis did hit, he was already ready to go. I played high school sports, and there was a phrase we used: be ready so that you don't have to get ready. Be ready so that you don't have to get ready. Daniel was ready because Daniel was faithful his whole life. He was already praying 3 times a day, and so when the crisis came, it didn't shake him because he was already ready. And I think that was actually his most influential witness. You want to know what throws Daniel into the lion's den? It's praying 3 times a day. It wasn't like he was doing some fancy, powerful thing. He literally was thrown in the den because he was on his knees 3 times a day. Can that be said of us? So here's what I want to ask you. What do people say about you? Do people see excellence in your work? Do people know you as someone with like really high character, that you have integrity and that you're trustworthy even when someone's not watching? And do they know that you're faithful with like the little things in life? For decades and decades, Daniel lived out this phrase coined by Eugene Peterson: a long obedience in the same direction. I want to be known as someone who's lived a long obedience in the same direction. Let me end with this story. My wife's name is Rachel, and Rachel's grandfather, his real name is Dale, but we call him Popsy. And Popsy, he's a legend. Just a legend, probably one of the nicest guys. He literally is the nicest guy I've ever met. Like, people will say that, no, I literally mean this. And here's a little bit of Popsy's story. Popsy grew up, and he grew up to be this really smart engineer, and he made and designed World War II planes. And after that, he got up a really high-end job working for a Ford Motor Company in Michigan. And he was in charge of their safety department and engineering for that. He was successful, made a good chunk of change. I mean, this is like a Daniel. But you know what is the thing that I remember most, and he's still alive, Popsy? Is that Popsy is so grounded. He's so faithful. He's so generous. He's so respected. I've never heard someone say one negative thing about Popsy, and I've known him for about 7 years. And it's not just what I've experienced. My wife's parents are divorced. And so Rachel's dad, who would be Popsy's ex-son-in-law, if you're following, my father-in-law, who divorced the family and kind of left, loves Popsy. Like he only has good things to say about Popsy. Still to this day, like he wants to hang out with him. He wants to have coffee with him because he just loves him, because you can't not love Popsy. And then Popsy now, the last decade, his wife, my wife's grandma, she's gotten dementia. And every day, this is the definition of faithfulness. He cooks for her. He cleans the house. He does the laundry. He takes her to the bathroom and cleans her up in that. And now she's been moved into an assisted living because she's continuing to decline. And Popsy goes to her place outside of Phoenix every single day to visit her. And it's not even really that she can remember much of it. But he is so faithful. He can be trusted. He had a strong work ethic at Ford. Did everything with excellence. I want to be like Popsy. Where an ex-son-in-law can only say good things about you even after he's divorced the family. Popsy was just like Daniel. I want to invite the worship team back up. And as we transition here to a time of response, here's what I want you to do. Could you just close your eyes? Why don't you just close your eyes and just extend your hands out like this? There's nothing magical about this. This isn't some manipulative thing. I just kind of want to walk you through a reflection. Because my guess is maybe you're here and you're like, Mark, I don't have a good reputation. I haven't excelled in my work. And if I'm honest, I haven't been faithful. And with your eyes closed and your hands out, I want you to hear this very clearly. There is good news for you. Because there's a greater Daniel. There's a greater Daniel, and I think you know his name. Listen to these parallels between Daniel and Jesus. Just as Daniel was framed on false charges by jealous Persian administrators, so Jesus was framed by jealous religious leaders. Jesus, like Daniel, was arrested in prayer at a private location. Pilate, like King Darius, worked for Jesus' release. Both Daniel and Jesus were turned over to be executed. King Darius sealed Daniel's tomb, and Jesus' tomb was sealed by the Roman government. Here's the difference, though. Daniel emerged without a scratch, and Jesus Christ was crucified for you. And the next day, Daniel got out of the den, and a couple days later, Jesus came out of his den. Both were alive. But Jesus coming alive guarantees that because of his body and blood, you too can experience resurrection. One scholar puts it this way: Daniel may have modeled for us how to live, but Jesus, the greater Daniel, makes our living possible, worthwhile, and everlasting. So, Holy Spirit, you're here. We just come before you today. We just ask, Lord, for your grace and your love to just overwhelm us. We give you all that we are, all that we've done, all that we haven't done. And we just say, Jesus, resurrect us today. So, Holy Spirit, come, minister. In Jesus' name, amen.